Samuel Greer found the woman's handprints in the mud before he found the woman herself. They pressed into the soft earth along the creek bank behind his barn, 4 of them, low and uneven, like someone had dragged themselves forward on palms and knees in the dark. The morning was cold for September in Wyoming. Frost still clung to the fence posts, and the creek ran gray under a pewter sky. Samuel stood over those handprints a long moment, his breath rising in slow clouds. He had not had a visitor at Dunmore Creek Ranch in 11 months, not since the funeral. He followed the trail. She was tucked between the base of the hay bales and the outer wall of the barn, half buried in loose straw. Her dark skirt torn at the hem and both shoes missing. A woman perhaps 30 years old, with black hair matted against her cheek and a bruise spreading yellow and purple from her left temple down toward her jaw. She breathed. That was the first thing he checked. Her eyes opened before he could speak. "Don't." She pulled back against the wall. "Don't call anyone." Samuel crouched down so he would not be towering over her. "I wasn't going to, please." Her voice was barely a sound. "If you send for the marshal, I'm dead before nightfall." He studied her face. He had learned in 51 years of living what lying looked like. This was not it. This was pure and animal fear. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried. She got one knee up before the pain stopped her. A sharp inhale, her hand pressing to her right side. "Don't," Samuel said. "Stay still." He carried her inside. His name was Samuel Greer, and he had owned Dunmore Creek Ranch in the shadow of the Wyoming Bighorns for going on 19 years. Once, the house had been full. His wife, Margaret, had hung curtains in every window and kept a kitchen garden that smelled like mint all summer long. Their son, Thomas, had grown up running between the barn and the creek, returning every evening with muddy knees and something to show his mother. A feather, a smooth stone, a beetle held gently in cupped hands. Thomas was 23 now and living in Cheyenne. He wrote letters twice a year that were polite and said nothing real. Margaret had died 4 winters ago of a fever that came fast and left no room for goodbyes. Samuel had sat beside her through 3 nights and watched the life go out of her, like a candle burned down to nothing. Afterward, he did not take her curtains down. He could not bring himself to. They hung there still, sun-bleached now, slightly stiff. Every morning he walked past them without looking directly at them. He had become a man who moved through his own house like a guest who knew he had stayed too long. He laid the woman on the settee near the iron stove and built the fire up. He brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, and he set them on the low table beside her without touching her. "I won't touch the wound without your say," he said, "but I need to know if it's bleeding." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were dark, the color of creek water in shadow, and they held something he recognized. Not fear exactly, more like the exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for so long it has become the weather they live in. "It was bleeding last night," she said. "I think it stopped." "What's your name?" A pause. "Nora Vance." He knew that name. The whole of Garnett County knew that name. It had been on the marshal's notice board in Caldwell Springs for going on 6 weeks. Wanted for theft and conspiracy to defraud. Nora Vance, age 31. Reward $200. Samuel sat back on his heels and looked at her. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "I can see you know it." $200, he said. "Yes, outside the creek ran, and a magpie called once from the cottonwood." "I've got enough," he said. "Tell me what happened to your side." Something flickered across her face, not gratitude exactly, more like confusion, the look of someone who has braced for a blow that did not come. She let him look at the wound. It was a gash along her lower right ribs, not deep enough to be mortal but ugly, edges swollen and hot. She flinched when he cleaned it but did not make a sound. "Who did this?" he asked. "Deputy Aldred Kane," she said. Samuel went still. Aldred Kane was not a man most people spoke against. He wore his badge the way other men wore a weapon, not for protection, for power. He was the hand of Marshal Theodore Fitch in Caldwell Springs, and Marshal Fitch had run Garnett County for going on 15 years, without anyone looking too closely at how. I need you to understand something, Nora said. Her voice had gone very steady, the way voices went when someone had rehearsed a speech so many times it had worn smooth. I did not steal anything, not 1 cent. What I did was find proof that other people had, and those people have badges and friends and I do not. Samuel bound the wound carefully. What kind of proof? She looked at him the way people looked at someone they were not sure they could afford to trust. The kind that would put Marshal Fitch in a federal prison, she said, and the kind that Deputy Kane would kill me to get back. Samuel sat on the low stool across from her and folded his hands between his knees. The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, his horses moved in the paddock with their slow, easy sound. Start at the beginning, he said. She did. Nora Vance had come to Caldwell Springs 14 months ago to take a bookkeeping position with the Garnett County Land Office. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. Her father had taught her ledgers before she learned to cook, which her mother had never entirely forgiven him for. The land office was small, housed in a clapboard building beside the assay office, and her employer was a man named Gordon Webb, who wore spectacles and smelled of pipe tobacco, and was, as far as Nora could tell, entirely harmless. It was the records that were not harmless. She noticed the first discrepancy, 3 months in. A land transfer recorded twice under different names, both transactions bearing the county seal. Both signed and dated within a week of each other. One deed transferred 40 acres of bottomland to a private buyer named R. Calloway. The second deed, filed 6 days later, showed the same 40 acres transferred to a different buyer, a man named Harlan Cross, at a price 3 times higher. There was no record of the first sale being voided. She brought it to Gordon Webb. He told her she had misread the entries. He told her to leave it alone. He said it so quietly, and with such careful blankness in his eyes, that she understood he was not correcting her. He was warning her. She left it alone, for 3 weeks. Then she found 7 more. The pattern, once she could see it, was not complicated. Several someones, were filing fraudulent land transfers through the county office, skimming the difference in sale prices into private accounts, and using the official seal to make the paperwork look clean. The names on the receiving end kept changing. The name authorizing the county seal did not. It appeared on every fraudulent transfer, initialed in the same careful hand. T. Fitch, Marshal, Garnett County. Nora had copied down every discrepancy she could find, working late on evenings when Gordon left early and the building was empty. She used her own paper. She kept the copies in the false bottom of her trunk at the boarding house. She told no one. She had intended to take the copies to the federal land office in Cheyenne. She had intended to do it quietly and without confrontation. She had intended a great many things that Deputy Aldred Kane made impossible on a Tuesday night in August, when he came to her room at the boarding house with 2 other men and turned everything over until he found the false bottom of the trunk. He didn't find all of it, Nora said. Samuel looked up from the fire. I had moved the most important pages 3 days before. I didn't know he was coming. I just knew he might, so I moved them. Her jaw tightened. They took what they found and arrested me on charges of theft. Said I had stolen county documents. Said I was conspiring to defraud the land office. She paused. The documents I had copied were evidence of their own crimes, and they arrested me for possessing them. Where are the other pages? Samuel asked. Safe. She said it with a precision that told him she had decided. For now, that was all she would say about it. He did not push. He had been a rancher long enough to know that pushing rarely brought you faster to water. That evening, after she had slept for 2 hours and eaten what he put in front of her without comment, salt pork and cold cornbread, the best he had on short notice, she sat by the stove and watched him mend a length of fence wire and said, almost to herself, "You haven't asked me to leave." "No," he said. "Why?" Samuel set the wire down and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "My wife used to say that a man's character isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does at 5 in the morning when no one is, and there's a frightened woman in his barn." He picked the wire back up. "I used to think that was sentimental. I've changed my mind." Nora was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was worth keeping." "She was," Samuel said. "I wasn't always good enough at showing it. That's the thing about losing people. You figure out too late what you should have said." A log shifted in the stove. The room settled into something that was not quite comfortable but was close to honest. "They'll come here," Nora said. "Kane will ask in town. Someone will have seen me on the road. Probably. If they find me, they'll say you were hiding a fugitive." Samuel looked at her steadily. "I know what they'll say. You could lose this ranch." He looked around the room. At the bleached curtains, the empty chair by the window where Margaret had liked to read, the low hook by the door where Thomas's boyhood hat still hung, too small for anyone now. A house full of things that used to mean something. "I'm not sure what I'd be losing," he said, "but I know what I'd be giving up if I put you back out in that cold." Nora looked at the fire for a long time. Then she said, "There's a woman in Caldwell Springs named Hattie Drum. She runs the seamstress shop on Baylor Street. She's the one who hid the pages for me." Samuel looked up. Hattie lost land to one of those fraudulent transfers 18 months ago. Bottom land her husband left her. She couldn't prove it. Couldn't understand why the deed she had didn't match the county record. But she knew something was wrong. Nora's voice had gone quiet. "She's not the only one. There are at least 4 other families in this county who lost land they should still own. They just never had any way to show it." Samuel set down the wire for good. "That's what's really in those pages," Nora said. "Not just proof that Fitch took money. Proof that real families lost real land because of it. Names, dates, amounts, all of it." The fire popped. Outside, the wind had come up off the mountain and was moving through the cottonwoods with a low, rushing sound. "If those pages ever reach a federal judge," Samuel said slowly. "Fitch is finished." "Yes, and Kane?" "Kane signed 3 of the transfers himself. He's not just Fitch's deputy. He's his partner." Samuel stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard, the outlines of the fence posts, the pale shape of the barn in the moonlight. Somewhere up the valley a coyote called, then went quiet. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He had never been. Margaret had teased him about it. "Samuel, you'd think 3 days before you stepped in out of the rain," and she had not been wrong. But when he did decide, he did not change his mind. He turned from the window. "Hattie Drum, you trust her? With my life. I already have." "Then here's what I think," Samuel said. "We need those pages, and we need a witness who isn't you or me. Someone Fitch can't discredit. Someone the county would have to listen to." Nora watched him carefully. "Who?" Samuel thought. "Judge Warren Pruitt holds circuit court out of Sheridan. He's not in Fitch's pocket. Fitch tried a few years back, and Pruitt threatened to have him investigated. Old history, but it's the right kind." He paused. "Pruitt is due in Caldwell Springs on the first Friday of October. That's 9 days. 9 days is a long time to stay hidden, or," Samuel said, "9 days is enough time to stop hiding." Nora was very still. "What are you thinking? Kane will come looking. He'll ask questions. And if he thinks you're wounded and frightened and alone somewhere nearby, he'll come here, quietly, without the authority of a warrant because he doesn't want a paper trail. He'll come to retrieve what he's missing, not to make an arrest." Samuel's voice was level. "If he comes without a warrant and says what he came here to say, and someone else hears him say it, you'd need witnesses he couldn't dismiss," Nora said. "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned lower and the room had gone to amber and shadow. "You'd be putting yourself directly in his way." "I would. He's dangerous, Samuel." It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed it. He thought she noticed noticing. "I know he is," Samuel said, "but I'm not the one who should be running, and neither are you." For the first time since he had carried her in from the barn, something shifted in Nora's face. Not hope exactly. Too careful for that. Too long accustomed to careful. but something adjacent to it. Something that suggested she had not entirely stopped believing things could go right. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about how." The next 2 days they planned. Samuel rode into Caldwell Springs on the second morning. Not to draw attention, but precisely because not going would draw more. He bought flour and lamp oil, and exchanged pleasantries with the man at the dry goods counter and said nothing remarkable. He passed the marshal's office without looking at it directly. He saw Deputy Kane through the window, standing at the notice board, and felt the particular coldness of knowing someone would soon come looking at you. On the way home, he stopped at the seamstress shop on Baylor Street. Hattie Drum was a small woman in her 60s, with hands roughened from decades of needlework and eyes that took your measure in about 4 seconds and gave nothing away. She listened to what Samuel said without interrupting. When he finished, she went to the back room and returned with a flat oilskin packet tied with brown cord. "Tell Nora I've been praying every morning," she said. "I'll tell her, and tell her Agatha Morse and the Pollock family are willing to speak, if it comes to that." Samuel paused. "Agatha Morse from out past Dry Fork?" "She lost 60 acres. Her daughter was too young to understand what happened at the time. She understands now." Hattie looked at him directly. "Nora didn't come to me for just those pages. She came to me because she had nowhere else to go. But I'm in this because those pages have my husband's name on them. And because Fitch has spent 15 years believing nobody in this county had the spine to stand up." Samuel took the packet. "We'll need you at the ranch Thursday before dawn." Hattie said, "I'll be there." He rode home through the long afternoon light, with the oilskin packet inside his coat, against his ribs, the way you carried something you could not afford to lose. When he laid it on the table in front of Nora, she did not open it immediately. She put her hand on it and closed her eyes for a moment, very briefly, the way someone might touch something they had been afraid they would never see again. Then she opened it, and they read through everything together by lamplight. The copies were meticulous. Nora's handwriting was small and precise, and she had noted not just the discrepancies but the page references, the filing dates, the initials that appeared on each. Cross-referenced, organized, the kind of work that took not just intelligence but patience. The patience of someone who knew she would only get one chance to be believed. "You did all of this alone," Samuel said. "I didn't have anyone to help me." He looked up at her. She was reading a page she had already read, eyes moving over familiar words, and she said it the way people said things they had accepted so completely the pain had gone underground. "You do now," he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. Something passed between them that neither of them was ready to name. He was not a man who rushed such things. She was not a woman who trusted them easily. But it was there, quiet and factual, the way the creek was there outside in the dark. They read until the lamp burned low. On Wednesday night, Samuel rode out to find Reverend Clement Ames of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell Springs, who was a man of 64, with a reputation for preaching hard truths in slow seasons and who had, as far as Samuel knew, never once said a thing he did not believe. He also found Jonas Whitfield, the postmaster, who had seen a land deed that hadn't looked right 8 months ago and mentioned it to Marshal Fitch, and been told in terms that were polite but unmistakable that he was to forget he'd seen it. Both men came to Dunmore Creek before dawn on Thursday. Samuel hid them in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, cold and close, with 2 lanterns between them, and told them to stay quiet no matter what they heard above. Kane came at mid-morning. He came with 1 man, not 3, which told Samuel that this was not an official visit. He rode into the yard and did not call out the way a man with legal authority would. He simply stopped his horse in front of the porch and waited. Samuel came out and stood on the top step. "Greer," Kane said. He was a lean man with a thin mouth and eyes the color of old tin. He wore his badge but not his rifle. Another calculation, another signal. He had come to talk first. "You've had a visitor. I've had a quiet week," Samuel said. "You were seen on the road into town 2 mornings ago." Kane looked past him at the house. Man alone out here, you notice things. Saw anything unusual? Anyone on foot? Nothing I'd call unusual. Kane's eyes came back to him. That woman who's wanted. Nora Vance. She's dangerous, Greer. I know she doesn't look it, but she's been stealing county property and she means to use it to do harm. Harm? To who? A pause. To good men who've worked hard to keep this county running. Samuel crossed his arms. What kind of county property are we talking about? Documents she had no right to take. Land office documents. Something shifted behind Kane's eyes. Just slightly. Like a man adjusting his footing on uncertain ground. That's right. Showing what, exactly? That's not your concern. I think it might be, Samuel said. Given that I've got neighbors who lost their land in ways that never quite made sense. Given that I've been hearing people wonder for years how Marshal Fitch manages to keep acquiring property on a marshal's salary. Kane's jaw tightened. You're talking about matters you don't understand. I understand that you rode to my ranch without a warrant, Samuel said. I understand you're not here to make an arrest. You're here to find out what she has, and whether anyone else has seen it. The silence stretched between them like wire pulled taut. If that woman is here, Kane said quietly, you need to think very carefully about what happens to you and this property if you protect her. I've thought about it. Greer. And I've thought about what happens to this county if the men running it face a federal judge with those documents in front of them. Samuel's voice stayed flat, no anger in it, nothing that could be mistaken for weakness. I think you should think about that too. Kane stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice stripped of all its official warmth, you're making a mistake that'll cost you everything. You came to my property without authority to threaten me into handing over a woman you tried to kill, Samuel said. I think we both know who's made the mistake here. The cellar door opened. Reverend Ames and Jonas Whitfield came up through the kitchen and stood in the doorway behind Samuel. They had heard it. All of it. And they were looking at Aldred Kane with a particular expression of people who have suspected something for a long time and have just had it confirmed. Nora walked out from the side room and stood beside Samuel. Kane looked at all four of them, and something passed over his face. Not fear, not quite, but the sudden understanding of a man who has walked into a place he cannot walk back out of. He turned his horse and rode, fast, toward Caldwell Springs. He'll go straight to Fitch, Nora said. Yes, Samuel said, and Fitch will want to manage this quietly. That's why we need to move now. They sent word to Hattie Drum that same afternoon. By the following morning, Agatha Morse had arrived in a wagon with her daughter, and a written statement signed by 3 other families in Garnett County, who had each lost land in the past 7 years to transfers they had never understood. Jonas Whitfield drafted a formal account of what he had witnessed that morning at Dunmore Creek Ranch, and signed it in his capacity as federal postmaster, which gave it a weight that local authority could not dismiss. Reverend Ames rode to Sheridan himself. He arrived at Judge Warren Pruitt's chambers with the oilskin packet, the signed witness account, and a letter of his own composition that described in plain and careful language what had been taking place in Garnett County, under the authority of Marshal Theodore Fitch and Deputy Aldred Kane. Judge Pruitt moved his circuit hearing up by 6 days. He arrived in Caldwell Springs on a gray Tuesday morning with 2 federal marshals and a court recorder. The proceedings were held in the First Methodist Church because the county courthouse was considered, under the circumstances, a compromised venue. Every pew was full. People had come in from Dry Fork and Powder River, and as far as the northern ranches, word having traveled the way. Word traveled in places where not much happened, and then suddenly everything did. Nora stood at the front of that church. She had a bruise still fading at her temple, and a wound still healing at her ribs, and she wore a plain gray dress that Hattie Drum had pressed for her that morning. And she stood in front of Judge Pruitt and every neighbor in Garnett County and told the truth in a clear voice that did not waver. She read from the copies she had made. She named the dates, the amounts, the initials. She named the families who had lost land. She named the women at the boarding house who had been pressured to stay quiet. She named Deputy Kane and the night he had come to her room and left her with a wound in her side and a warrant she had never deserved. When she finished, the church was very quiet. Then Agatha Morse stood up. She was a woman of 60, and she stood slowly, the way people stood when their knees hurt, and they stood anyway. And she said, I want to say, in front of God and everyone here, that Nora Vance came to my door 6 weeks ago, and I turned her away because I was afraid. I am not afraid now, and I am sorry it took me this long. Jonas Whitfield stood and confirmed what he had seen and heard. Hattie Drum stood and told the story of her husband's land. One by one, other people stood. Some wept. Some simply said their names and what had been taken from them and sat back down. But they stood. Marshal Fitch was taken into federal custody before noon. Deputy Kane was arrested at the edge of town while attempting to leave with 2 saddlebags, and no explanation. The land cases would take months to untangle. The law moved slowly, and the paperwork of injustice was always more elaborate than the paperwork of repair. But the untangling had begun. Outside the church, in the pale October light, Samuel stood beside Nora, and neither of them said anything for a moment. 11 months. That was how long Dunmore Creek Ranch had been a house he moved through, without looking at things directly. 11 months since the funeral, since Thomas had shaken his hand and gotten back in the wagon for Cheyenne, since Samuel had started eating supper, standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting at the table alone felt like a kind of theater. He was not a man who talked about such things easily. He was aware of that. He had been aware of it for most of his life, and Margaret had learned to read him sideways, to catch what he meant from the long way around. He missed that. He had not let himself say so before now. I owe you something, Nora said. You don't. I do. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that had not been there the morning he found her in his barn. Not just the absence of fear, but something more deliberate. The look of a woman deciding to trust the ground she was standing on. You gave up your quiet for this. My quiet wasn't doing me much good, Samuel said. Your curtains could use replacing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something in the steadiness of it felt like a door swinging open in a room that had been closed a long time. Hattie offered, he said. She said she has fabric left over from a job in August. Blue, I think she said. Blue would be good, Nora said. I thought so too. The mountains were very clear in the north, the way they got in October. All the haze of summer burned away and the peaks clean and cold against the sky. Samuel's horses would need to come down from the high pasture in another 2 weeks. The fences on the east side of the property needed work before the snow came. He had a list of things to do, as always, and for the first time in 11 months it felt less like a sentence and more like a life. He did not ask her, not yet. That was not the kind of man he was, and she was not the kind of woman who would have wanted it done in haste on a courthouse step. But when Nora walked beside him to where the horses were tied, and he held the reins a moment longer than necessary to let her settle, she did not move away from him. She stayed close, in that way that said something the two of them had not yet found the words for, but would. Dunmore Creek Ranch had been a place of mourning for a long time. It was ready, Samuel thought, to be something else. Because a man could shelter a wounded stranger and call it duty. But truth, carried into daylight at cost and without guarantee of safety, and the quiet courage it took to stand where you were afraid. That was what changed a place. That was what changed a person. And some mornings, if you were paying attention, it arrived before dawn in the frost, pressed into the mud beside your barn, asking nothing but a chance.